these notes a little bit shorter than the first, but I'm doing what I can. Okay, where we left off in class, we talked about the Pacific Theater and the Japanese getting defeated at the Battle of Midway. Now I want to shift back to Europe, and I want to talk about what was going on during World War II in Germany. We talked about Hitler and claiming that the Aryan race was the master race. The Nazis thought that the Aryan or Germanic peoples were the master race. Anybody who was Jewish or non-Aryan, which he called, they were thought to be inferior, and this led to the Holocaust. And as you well know, the Holocaust was just a mass slaughter of civilians who were looked on as subhuman or inferior, non-Aryan, especially the Jews. Jews were targeted for the causes of problems and failures. A lot of times Hitler would blame the Jews for losses and any kind of problems they were having. He blamed the Jews for the loss of World War I and the economic problems. So Hitler placed a lot of Germany's blame in the hands of the Jews. He also deprived them of their rights. He set into place the Nuremberg laws, and that deprived Jews of their rights of German citizenship, jobs, property, and they were not allowed to hold public office because of this. So they had no representation. So the Jewish people were very oppressed. One event that sticks out in the Holocaust is called Kristallnacht, and that just means the night of broken glass. A 17-year-old Jew named Herschel Greenspan, he was from Germany. He was visiting a relative in Paris, and while he was in Paris, his father was deported from Germany to Poland. This made Herschel very angry, and to take out his anger, he attacked the German embassy in France, and he shot an employee, and this pretty much launched a full-fledged attack on the Jews in Germany. On November 9th, this became known as Kristallnacht, which is the night of the broken glass, and this caused many Jews to flee Germany to go to other countries because now they were being attacked, and they were being brutally attacked. Many of the other nations began to accept and receive Jews. Other nations were receiving these refugees in mass numbers. This is a picture over here of Kristallnacht, and this is another picture from the Holocaust, and we talked about in class. They had to wear the Jewish stars to identify that they were Jewish. You guys know about the Holocaust. You've read Anne Frank. You have knowledge. You know it was just a horrible time. So Hitler tried getting rid of Jews through immigration, forcing them to go either to their home country or to another country. He ordered Jews to move to certain cities in Poland where they were placed in ghettos or segregated Jewish areas. So he was trying to force the Jews into one area called ghettos. And he sealed these ghettos with barbed wire and stone walls, and he basically wanted to starve them or have them die of starvation. They were deprived of lots of food. They were deprived of adequate medical care. But this really didn't stop a lot of the Jews. They oftentimes had people smuggle things in. They formed resistance groups within the ghettos. They taught in secret schools within the ghettos. They kind of banded together to kind of make the best of the situation. But this was Hitler's kind of resort before he had gotten to the mass extermination of kind of getting the Jews isolated in one area. These are just some pictures. This is a picture of a Jew in a ghetto, and you can see the officers are taunting him, making fun of him, humiliating him. And this is another picture of Jews in concentration camps where they were held after the next step from the ghettos. Hitler came up with what is known as his final solution. He got very impatient. He wanted the Jews to get rid of the Jews. He wanted them to die, so he issued a plan called the final solution. And this plan was a genocide. It was a system of genocide, or a systematic killing of an entire race of people. So he basically unleashed genocide on the Jewish people. Hitler believed that he had to purify the Aryan race. He had to make sure that Europe was only filled with the superior humans, and he needed to get rid of any subhumans. And that just meant anyone who was not white, blonde hair, blue-eyed, natural-looking German people. So anybody was subject to Hitler's terror. After he had placed the Jews in the ghettos and he had come up with his final solution, the mass killings began, and the SS squads would round up and they would kill Jews. They would take them, oftentimes, they would take them down, and the killing squads would kill them. Those who were not reached by the killing squads, they were rounded up and sent to concentration camp, where they were forced to work 7 days a week, little food, horrible conditions. You guys know about the Holocaust. You know what the Jews were subjected to, but he hoped that in the concentration camps that the conditions would eventually kill off the Jews. Hitler began carrying out his final extermination, which took place in 1942, and that's when concentration camps became equipped with gas chambers. What happened is, as Jews were admitted into each concentration camp, they were separated as weak and strong, and the weak were taken to the quote-unquote showers, where they were sprayed with cyanide gas. And the gas chambers, they were able to kill about 6,000 people in one day. Approximately 6 million people were killed in death camps, and fewer than 4 million people survived. What happened in the Holocaust, you guys, like I've said, you're aware of some of this stuff, but we're just going to re-hit it. Concentration camps, living conditions were horrible. They were given tiny rations. They barely any food. They were separated from their families. Very, very difficult to survive. If you weren't killed in the gas chambers, a lot of times you were starved. You were killed for not working fast enough. Sometimes they would use these prisoners as medical experiments, so they would try out new experiments on them, sometimes infect them with diseases so that they could try out new medicines. They were literally not treated like human beings. And this was Hitler's way of trying to purify the Aryan race. And it was very sad and very, very traumatic during World War II. Back to the battlefront, while that was going on in Germany, the Allies were trying extremely hard to become victorious to stop the genocide in Germany, as well as stop Hitler in his reign. December 22nd, 1941, Winston Churchill and Theodore Roosevelt met at the White House to develop a joint war policy. And at this time, Stalin came and asked for help against the German forces. He basically wanted to split the war into two fronts and kind of split up the German aggression to kind of split their resources. The Allies began to turn the tide of the war to two fronts, the Mediterranean in North Africa and the Eastern Front in Russia. In North Africa, the Germans, we talked about on the last video, Erwin Rommel, or the Desert Fox, had already taken over the city of Tobruk. But Great Britain, they sent a man by the name of Bernard Montgomery. He took control of the British forces in North Africa. Montgomery poses an attack at El Alamein, where the Germans were occupied, and they surprised them. They surprised the Axis troops on October 23rd. The Germans, under Rommel, they fight back fiercely, but they are defeated, and they have to retreat westward. So the Allies launch what is known as Operation Torch, and U.S. forces under General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who eventually becomes president, they land in Morocco and Algeria, and they basically are able to smash the Africa Tank Corps that was under the direction of the Desert Fox. So this was a huge victory in North Africa for the Allies in May 1943. This was a big victory in the Mediterranean. Now, to the Eastern Front, in class we had talked about the Russian winters that were really tearing down the German fleet. However, the Russian winter is over, and the German tanks were ready to go again. They were ready to go and go and invade and take over Russia. So Hitler sends his 6th Army south to seize the oil fields in the Caucasus Mountains and Stalingrad on the Volga River. This results in the Battle of Stalingrad, which was August 23rd, 1942. The Luftwaffe as we've talked about in class, they went on bombing raids, and it basically set the city of Stalingrad on fire. Stalingrad was basically a ruined city. It was very desperate, but Joseph Stalin, the one we've talked about, he basically told his troops, "You better defend the city that's named after me to the death." So even though the city of Stalingrad was completely deteriorated, left to rubble, left to ruins, the Russians, the Soviet army, the Red Army, stays to defend it at all costs. By November of 1942, the Germans controlled about 90% of the city. So the Germans had a very good advantage. They were almost victorious. However, that Russian winter we've been talking about sets in, and on November 19th, the Soviet troops are able to launch a counterattack. And in that counterattack, they're able to trap the Germans, cut off their supplies, and this really scares Friedrich von Paulus. He begs Hitler to let them retreat. But Hitler replies, just like he had before, that the city had to be held at all costs. The results are very grim. About 90,000 of the German troops surrender to the Soviet. They were frostbitten. They were starving. It was a very pitiful situation. The German army was in horrible shape at Stalingrad. So they surrendered to the Soviets, and basically the Germans are now put on the defensive against the Soviets. So at the Battle of Stalingrad, the Germans lose due to another Russian winter. And like we talked about in class, this reminds us of another historical leader named Napoleon. So think about that. The Russian winter sets in, and the Russians are able to chokehold the Germans and basically cut off their supply lines, starve them into surrender. So after Stalingrad, Stalin appeals to the Americans and the British to invade and liberate France. But Churchill and Roosevelt, they wanted to meet in Morocco, and they decide that they needed to take over Italy first. So July 10th, 1943, the Allied forces go in, they take over Sicily, and they capture it from the Italians and the Germans. So they capture Sicily from Axis powers. This conquest, this victory of Sicily was enough to get Mussolini knocked from power, and King Victor Emmanuel III fires him, has him arrested, and Italy surrenders on September 3rd, 1943. However, the Germans are able to seize control of northern Italy, and they're able to put Mussolini back in charge. However, the Germans start to retreat northward, and the Allies are able to enter Rome on June 1944. They continue fighting until Germany falls in May 1945. As the Germans are retreating out of northern Italy after they fall, some Italian resistance fighters find Mussolini in a truck, get disguised as a German soldier. He is shot and he is hung in a Milan town square. So Mussolini is found trying to escape Italy, disguised as a German soldier. So he eventually meets his fate. On the home front, in the United States, just like World War I, World War II becomes a total war. At this time, we talked about total war with World War I and the way that the world had responded to World War I. And there was a lot of similarities between the war front and World War I and World War II. The U.S. converts their factories to strictly wartime production. Auto factories start to produce tanks. Typewriter companies, they're starting to produce shells. So pretty much all the industries are starting to convert to put towards the war effort. All the workers working toward the war effort. People are doing rationing. We talked about rationing with World War I, but they're having to ration those household items. We talked about the little rationing books that they would use. Propaganda was something that was huge during World War II. You guys know about Rosie the Riveter, and you know about some of the famous World War II posters. They were just little propaganda. Sometimes they would be in film clips. Sometimes they would be in poster. It was just to encourage people to continue to support the war effort, whether it was to buy war bonds, whether it was in any kind of anti-Hitler message. These propaganda campaigns would kind of appeal to people's emotions. They would appeal to people's feelings and try to get them to further support the war effort. Other things that happened on the war front or the home front, the Japanese Americans that were living in the United States, they had their rights jeopardized because people oftentimes saw them as a threat because of their ancestry, because of their ethnicity. Japanese were sent to internment camps. Because of the Pearl Harbor attacks and because we were fighting Japanese in the Pacific, a lot of times people were very nervous of the loyalty to these Japanese Americans and if they were actually staying loyal to the Americans. So they were a lot of times sent to these internment camps in the United States. Okay, here's an example of some propaganda posters, and I hate that this one's cut off, but this is kind of appealing to people that, we don't want the Germans to come get us, so buy these war bonds because we don't want your children to get affected by the war or by the Nazis. And here is another that's kind of funny that gets people, kind of appeals to people's humor of, let's get Hitler, we need to keep fighting so we can tear him down. So these are just examples of propaganda posters used during World War II. Okay, so war in this time had really turned in favor of the Allies. And so the Allies come up with a plan to, they start to build a force in Great Britain. They want to go in and liberate France from Germany. And they come up with a plan to attack the Germans across the English Channel. This is where we get the origins of the D-Day invasion. By May 1944, the invasion force was ready. The force that they had been building in Great Britain was ready. They were fighting under Dwight D. Eisenhower, like I said, who later becomes president. He was first the general in the World War II. So under Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Allies start to plan this storm or this attack on the Germans at the beaches of Normandy, which is in northwestern France. The name is actually Operation Overlord, but it's called D-Day, known as Designated Day. And the designated day for the attack was on June 6, 1944. Now the Allies wanted to kind of, excuse me, the Allies wanted to trick the Germans because the Germans knew an attack was coming, but they wanted to keep them guessing. They wanted to keep them wondering. So they set up kind of a dummy army with its own headquarters, its own equipment, and they set up this dummy army to attack the beaches at Calais to kind of throw the Germans off. But on June 6, 1944, the Allied troops pose a massive attack on the beaches at Normandy, and this is known as the greatest land and sea attack in all of history. During the attack, the Allies were able to hold the beachheads, and the beachheads, they are just the that enemy shoreline that's captured right before the enemy's going to invade. So they're able to hold those beachheads, and by July 25th, 1944, the Germans start to retreat. By August 25th, 1944, the Allies had liberated France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and most of the Netherlands, which Hitler had swept through, taken over on his way to take over in France. For the Allies, this victory at D-Day was huge. Their next stop was going to be Germany. And here are just some pictures from the D-Day attacks. As you can see, they're storming them on the beaches of Normandy. Very, very famous battle. I'm sure you've heard of it before. That's where Dwight D. Eisenhower gets very famous. As the Allies are starting to move toward Germany in the west, the Soviets, who were victorious at Stalingrad, are starting to move toward Germany in the east. So Hitler counterattacks in the West. He's hoping to split up the British and American forces and cut off their supply lines. And this attack in the West is known as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler is able to break through the American defense there that were lined in the Ardennes, which we talked about as the foresty area in Luxembourg. So Hitler's able to break through the American troops, and the Americans were very caught off guard. But they are able to push Hitler and his troops back and claim victory. The Allies, they pushed back the Germans and they win, and the Nazis, they really had no other choice but to retreat. Hitler had lost a very large amount of men that he was not able to replace. So after the Battle of the Bulge, it's very important to understand that Hitler starts to make his downward spiral. March 1945, the Allies cross into Germany and they approach Berlin from the southwest. Like I said earlier, the Soviets, they are approaching Germany from the east. The Soviets, they surround Berlin and they just start firing. They wage war. Their artillery is firing, their shells flying all over Berlin. And at this time, Hitler starts to prepare for defeat. He goes into his underground headquarters. He married his longtime companion, mistress, Eva Braun. We talked about that in class with some of you guys. And he writes his final address to his people. 2 days after he does this, he and his wife, Eva Braun, both commit suicide. Hitler drinks poison and then shoots himself. Eva Braun drinks poison. May 7th, 1945, Dwight D. Eisenhower takes the surrender, accepts the surrender from the Germans, or the Third Reich, as they became known. And the bad thing, the upsetting, sad thing, is Franklin D. Roosevelt, the president at the time, he actually dies before he's able to see the surrender. But Harry Truman gets news of surrender, and he accepts the surrender on May 8th, 1945, which becomes known as VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. So in May, the Germans fall. However, the war is still very much happening in the Pacific. The Allies are still fighting in the Pacific. In the fall of 1944, the Allies, the Allies move in on Japan. They land on the Philippines under Douglas MacArthur, the general in the Pacific, and MacArthur basically says, I'm here to save the Philippines, but it was going to be a harder task than he thought. At the Battle of Leyte, the Japanese come up with the solution that they are going to destroy all the American ships so they cannot supply their ground troops. The Allies can't supply their ground troops. However, in order to carry this out, the Japanese had to risk their entire naval fleet. In the process of destroying American ships, Japan loses its navy as a force in the war. They had lost they lost disastrously. The Japanese navy is not successful. The only thing that is left were the kamikaze pilots that we talked about in class, the suicide pilots, and the Japanese army. So the Japanese basically lose their navy as a force in the war. They chose to make a risky move in trying to destroy American ships with their naval fleet, and it backfires. So now the Americans are facing the Japanese army as well as the Japanese kamikaze fighters. The Americans were able to retake the Philippines. They start to move toward the areas that were more threatening in Japan, which were Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These both were extremely intense battles. So the American Marines, they moved to take Iwo Jima. They're able to take Iwo Jima, and that's where this very famous picture comes from of the 6 soldiers raising the flag, comes from the victory at Iwo Jima. And then they move on to Okinawa. And Okinawa was a very bloody battle. It was the bloodiest land battle in the war. And this is where the Japanese introduced kamikaze pilots. And the kamikaze pilots, we talked about them a little bit in class. but it was the pilots who they volunteered with just enough fuel to reach the Allied ships, and they would dive bomb into the ships. So this was an extremely intense battle, and after about 2 months, the United States was able to take the Okinawa. Next move was Japan. Truman, the president at the time, he was pretty apprehensive about taking in Japan, was about invading Japan. He thought this would result in a really heavy loss of life. So Truman had to make a decision. He had to decide how they were going to get the Japanese to surrender. He had to decide whether or not he was going to use this new weapon that had just been introduced called the atomic bomb. And the atomic bomb would result in the quickest end to war. And it was developed by the Manhattan Project. And it basically, the atomic bomb would pretty much just wipe out a huge number of people and end war in the Pacific. Basically, Truman said if they didn't surrender, they could expect to be they could expect a rain of ruin from the air. But the Japanese did not respond. So August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, the U.S. drops another A-bomb on the city of Nagasaki. At Hiroshima, about 73,000 people die in the attack, and at Nagasaki, about 37,500 people. About the radiation that the A-bombs caused killed more people, and it was a very, very brutal attack. After these two bombs were dropped on September 2nd, the Japanese surrendered to General Douglas MacArthur, and the war in the Pacific had officially ended. So this is the end of World War II. In class, we're going to talk about what Europe and the world looked like after World War II and how they started to rebuild.